Well, I'm perfectly aware of the ongoing propaganda wars between the United States and Russia in regards to Ukraine. But the fact remains that U.S. foreign policy is basically centered on the fact, or centered on the assumption, of slow eastward expansion of NATO. That is the basic policy and has been in place since the breakup of the Soviet Union. And I believe that the United States government is completely overreaching at this point. So I do realize that the that U.S. interests in the region uh, contain basically energy supplies. This is what this is all about. This entire geopolitical conflict in the Ukraine. And when I listen to alternative sources such as Russia Today, I am completely aware that they have their own bias and that they have their own national interests in mind when they go about propagandizing, the badness of the U.S., the badness of the EU, and so on. But I believe, reading between the lines here, that essentially Russia is not the aggressor here. Russia could do much worse. They're actually, in my opinion, trying to de-escalate the situation as best as they can. Now, mind you, they have their own national interests in mind, and those interests have nothing to do with reestablishing communism in the former Soviet Union, or in Russia itself, the Russian Republic. So they're basically very much interested in a market economy now. And you have to realize that both governments, Russia and the United States, are completely corrupt. Um, so you have to take anything any side says with a grain of salt. But since here in the West, we're constantly prone to Western propaganda, I basically take anything with a grain of salt. And these articles recently published in the Guardian of the UK aren't exactly helpful. And I'm basically gonna try to point out some bias here, some obvious bias, and try to critique it. I'm just an ordinary citizen like the rest of us. I'm not a policymaker, so let's go to the article by printed in the Guardian just a few days ago. It's entitled, and I'll put a link to it in my video. It's entitled the EU sends advisors to help Ukraine bring law and order to rebel areas. This was written on 26th of July, so a couple of days ago. The EU has parachuted a team of security advisors into Kiev to assist the Ukrainian government in imposing the rule of law in rebel districts in a provocative move likely to further inflame relations with Moscow. Now, just here in the first paragraph, there's so much absurdity here that you have to laugh at it, really. So in other words, what this says is that the European Union has parachuted, this is people coming down on parachutes into Kiev, no less, Kiev. Now, advisors simply come down by parachutes into Kiev, not anywhere else in the Ukraine, but into Kiev. I mean, it's just simply laughable, this first paragraph. And then the article goes on to say, Catherine Ashton, the EU's foreign policy chief, agreed last week to requests from the Ukrainian authorities for urgent help in bolstering the country's security services. Now, I'm gonna really point out the the absolute absurdity of all this, okay? If you want to read up on Catherine Ashton, I'm going to post a very revealing link to this woman's background. First of all, Catherine Ashton has never held any elected office in the EU structure itself. This is a woman who has been appointed to every post she's ever held. She has no foreign policy, let alone security policy experience whatsoever. It is simply a joke. And in my humble opinion here, basically she's being used as a tool, you know, now that she holds this title of, what is it, EU's foreign policy chief, to basically inflame the entire situation between Western governments and Russia as a whole. This is an inexcusable ratcheting up of basically warmongering. That's all you can call it, really. Now, mind you, the Europeans have very close economic ties to Russia. And these economic ties will probably work in order to prevent war rather than heating all this rhetoric up. And if any kind of conventional war takes place between, let's say, the US, which is completely ratcheting up the pressure here, guess where this is going to take place? It's going to take place in Europe. So the Europeans as a whole have absolutely nothing to gain with any confrontation with Russia. So let me go a bit further here. Basically, the objections, some of the objections go as follows. Now, if Putin didn't have anything to do with the pro-Russian insurgency in the east of Ukraine, he would have ended it by announcing that he doesn't recognize the self-proclaimed People's Republic over there and has no intentions of absorbing these territories into Russia. Well, if the EU and the US in particular didn't have anything to do with the Euromaidan protests, they would have ended them by proclaiming that they didn't recognize the self-proclaimed regime in the Ukraine. So it goes both ways here. Why will nobody consider the possibility that this conflict amongst different factions within the Ukraine itself has nothing to do with the Ukrainians? This is all being controlled essentially by interests from outside forces. And as it stands right now, it is essentially the Ukrainian military, with the help from the US and the EU, which is launching an all-out assault on the Donetsk region, which is where the airliner went down. And then at the same time, they're accusing these rebel factions or these separatists in the eastern part of Ukraine of obfuscating or of basically hindering the continuous airline disaster investigation over there. Well, who's assaulting whom at this point? You know, where are the missiles? Where are all these armaments? Where are all these where are these artillery badges landing? Well, exactly in that region. And they're coming from massively, and by Ukraine's own admission, are landing in that territory. So this is just a complete mess at this time. And going back to Catherine Ashton, you should really click that link And admittedly, it's only a Wikipedia link here, but nobody else has any information on this woman other than Wikipedia, and so far that hasn't been altered yet. So I encourage you to read this link as to what this woman is all about. I mean, it's absolutely appalling. The European population should be outraged about this wedge that the United States is driving into their midst because of their own geopolitical interests in the region. Because I can guarantee you, European, American foreign policy centers on the objective not to have any very close economic ties between the Europeans and the Russians. Heaven forbid that some other economic force should come about in which the United States is no longer the hegemony of the past, And just to let you know that this kind of ratcheting up of war rhetoric, and I mean, this relations between the United States and Russia have never been more confrontational since the Cold War, and the rhetoric is being ratcheted up from our side, not from the Russians. And regardless of, you know, who downed that airliner, here's just a small example of what this can lead to. Back in 1983, at the height of the Cold War, and amid suspicions on either side, there was an exercise conducted by NATO, and this was a nuclear war game exercise. Well, let's put it this way. It almost led to mistaken conclusions, which could have led to an all-out nuclear war. These declassified documents became public in 1990. And it involved the escalation of rhetoric of fear-mongering and war-mongering from all sides, essentially. So there was a NATO exercise, as I say, called Able Archer. And this exercise took place under NATO, and it involved nuclear war games. You know, there were no strategic forces actually being put into place. It was basically a computer game, you know, as to how each side would respond. And because of the heightened tensions, the Soviets at that time interpreted this war game not just as a strategic war game, in other words, something that the US or NATO militaries came up with as strategic gameplay, but that something actually was being planned. Now, at that same time, because of all these heightened tensions, the Soviets shot down, mistakenly, I might add, a Korean airliner which had strayed into their airspace. So the situation in heightened tensions during this heightened tension period also involved a downed aircraft, civilian aircraft, in which 200 and some people died. And this, of course, inflamed the situation even further. And so during these exercises that NATO was doing, these strategic exercises, computer games essentially, the Soviets got really, really suspicious, and it only took one false alarm, essentially, on by their defensive systems, in order to pinpoint a missile which was launched, an ICBM, which supposedly was launched by the United States. Now, this all turned out to be a computer glitch on their part, but the fact remains that had not one Soviet officer, um, I wouldn't call intervene, but was not too trigger happy once he saw these signs on his computer screens and the intelligence that he was fed, and took just about 15 minutes to say, wait a minute, this might just be a false alarm here. If it would have not been for that individual, we would have ended up in all-out nuclear war. And in that case, you know, it really doesn't matter anymore what side, whose side you're on and which side was right. So I find this escalation of war rhetoric and economic sanctions and all this stuff emanating from the United States towards Russia at this point extremely dangerous and worrying. And that's probably why this video of mine is a bit longer than my video regarding the situation in Gaza. I mean, it is all somewhat intertwined, but people are rightfully worried